Hi, Michelle here from Bloomella, and thank you so much for joining me for another Bloom in 5. And today we are painting spring moths. So here we have the selection here. This video will be a quick run through, but if you would like the full version, then join me over on Patreon. The link's in my bio. So to get started, you can see I've already sketched out the 5 pretty spring moths, and the one I'm currently painting is a Pandora Sphinx moth. Below that will be a clouded magpie. In the middle at the top will be a box tree. At the bottom right there's a swallowtail, which is a really pretty yellow, and then on the far right we have a walnut sphinx. So as you can see, the initial step is to lay down the base colour. So I've used a really pretty sap green and a mix of browns, and I've just mixed those together on my palette to create the pretty base for the sphinx moth. And now we're moving on to the clouded magpie. So this one is super detailed, so we're just starting off with a very quick light grey wash and just adding in some darker grey details as well, just using a fairly large round brush. You could use something like an 8 or a 10, which would be ideal for doing these bases. I have a lot more details all on my Patreon, so if you would like the specific talk through of this version, which is quite long and detailed and includes all of the colour names and brushes used and mixes, if you'd like all of that, then the link is on my bio, or you can go to patreon.com/Bloomella. So moving back to the moths, we have the pretty box tree, which is a sort of grey brown moth, and we're just starting with a very light wash and adding some of that brown detailing as well. And you can see how we're moving the brush in different directions to get that coverage and to create those different moth effects. So the important thing is to do the first layer and then just to allow that to dry, so then you can add more details on top. So if you want to add any wet on wet technique, this is the time to do it on your base layer. As you can see with our clouded magpie, we've added in some little blurry dots that will act as a base for our detail to go on top. So now we're doing our pretty swallowtail, and this is a super lovely yellow, and then we're moving on to the walnut sphinx, which is obviously a walnut colour, which is actually ends up quite deep brown, so we'll add quite a lot of sort of walnutty colours to the moth to create that pretty effect and the pretty patterning. We're just moving back onto our Pandora Sphinx moth, which has quite a lot of detail in it. There'll be a lot of line detail and layering up on this one. As you can see, we're already building those layers by using some pretty greens and browns, and I do include all the images on Patreon as well, so people can copy directly from those images that I have used if they want to as well. So we're just blacking out some of the central area on the left wing and just adding in some of those details that need to be boxed off. Then we're going to duplicate this on the other side as well. If you've never painted any butterflies or moths or anything symmetrical, please don't worry too much about it being hyper realistic and hyper symmetrical. The main thing to focus on is just the technique and having fun and learning how the watercolour flows together. If you are quite experienced and you've painted moths and butterflies before, then you can focus a little bit more on the symmetry and getting a lot more of those details down. But the most important thing, like I say, is to have fun with watercolour and just to learn something new each time. Try not to put any pressure on it, as it will become unenjoyable, and just try to learn new things every single time you paint. New techniques, new colour mixes and things like that will really help improve your technical skill. So moving on to our clouded magpie, we're just using a slightly smaller brush now and just adding in some of this detail. It really reminded me of like leopard print. I really love wearing leopard print. It reminds me of like super tropical. I don't have as much as I did when I was younger, but I do love a bit of leopard print, even if it's just leopard print boots or a leopard print jumper. And yeah, this moth ended up turning out to be one of my favourites because I loved I don't think it is leopard print detail on the moth, but it just reminded me of that with like the brown and the black and the spots. So yeah, I really enjoyed painting this one, and yeah, I really enjoyed looking at the pattern afterwards. I thought how it came together, it looked really pretty in watercolour. So we're just adding a few of the little spots, and again, I haven't worried too much about it being symmetrical. Obviously we want to get a symmetrical feel, but I'm just focusing mainly on the technical skill of how to recreate these moths. So it just depends on what you're trying to achieve from your paintings. If you want something hyper realistic, something loose and flowing, or something a little bit more detailed, then these are the aspects that you can focus on within creating your moths. So we're just creating the edge on our pretty box tree. This one is a little bit sort of paler and has a little bit of a detail, and a lot of the moths have this really sweet little fringing. If you've ever looked at a moth close up, on the edge of the wings it's almost like a little tasseled fringing effect, and it's super sweet, and you could achieve this just using the tip of the brush and just doing very gentle small strokes, and it recreates that look. And then you can add in some darker values of that same colour to add in a little bit of sort of makes it look a little bit more 3D and a bit more dimension to it, rather than just a flat one succession of like tasseled lines. So it seems a little bit more realistic if you're trying to create that extra detail. So you can see we're just adding some extra lines onto the moth here and really building up the colours, and using different variations of colours as well within one design will really help to create that unified look while adding a little bit of variation and making it appear more 3D. So our swallowtail is this super pretty yellow, and it has these little lines on the wings, so we're just putting those on there and adding a little bit of outline as well. And it has this sweet little swallowtail, as you can see from the name, these little points that come down on the wings, and they have those tiny little details I was talking about as well. And also there's these little red dots, so those sorts of details really help add character to the animal or insect or whatever you're trying to paint. So it's important to pick up on these little details as you see them. So we're just adding some more of the line detail and a little bit of the fur detail. It's a really sweet texture round the head and the top of the body of the moth. It was really sort of like a hairy, furry texture, so we added that with some delicate little lines building up from our yellow base. And then as you can see, we're moving on to the walnut sphinx now, and we're really getting some depth with that colour, adding in a much darker brown and some line details where we want to base some of the details of our wing and also the body. A lot of the moths have this sort of texture that builds up through the body, so it's almost like in these little segments, and it's sort of different textures, and you can sort of recreate this with using like a line effect, but instead of doing it quite blocky, it's quite good to do it freehand and just build that up, and really helps to create that watercolour feel. And you can always add a little bit of darker value at the sides if you wanted them to appear a little bit more 3D on the body and the base. So again, we're just moving back to our Pandora Sphinx moth. It's quite good if you're painting more than one item at a time, or if you're painting something quite large, then it gives you a little bit more time for other areas to dry. I just have to be super careful not to smudge some of the moths that I've already created, because it's very easy to just catch them and not realise, and yeah, ruin some of the designs. But as we're just creating individual elements, it's not too bad, whereas if you're creating like a scene, you obviously don't want to ruin certain elements of the scene, so you just need to be a little bit careful with that. But we're just adding a lot more detail now as we're building up our third layer of watercolour. We're just adding in some of that orange detail. There's like some orange lining. You could have left this as negative space and painted it in afterwards, but I've just added like a sharp orange colour on top, as this is like an easier way to do it if you're just building up your watercolour skills. And you can see we're adding a lot of fine line details, which adds to the effect of this type of moth. And we're just sort of bringing those up to the centre and adding in a lot of that detail and a slightly darker colour than the base colour that we used, and just trying to duplicate that from one side to the other, and building up that colour as well, that blocked out black colour that was used sort of at the top of the wings and just at the sides as well. This is such a pretty moth. The wings are like so delicate, and you can see how this would be really camouflaged in like a tree or bush, or on a pack of sort of a set of leaves, sorry. You'd see how this would really sort of disappear into nature. So it was a really interesting moth to paint, and the colours were super pretty and organic. So yeah, it was really interesting. I really like doing the Bloomin' 5 videos, because it's interesting how you have to sort of research these different insects or objects or whatever we're painting this week, and it gives me a chance to really look into insects that I never would have seen before. So it's very interesting. So I hope you find it interesting too, to see these different type of species. So back to the moth, you can see on this one specifically, there was like a line down the middle of the body that was a little bit lighter. So I've achieved this by painting it darker on either side with the little lines, which also shows the segmented areas of the body. And then going back to our clouded magpie, just making sure I get the name right there, you can see we've had a little bit more detail around the outlines, and a little bit more of the fringing technique I was talking about along the bottom edge there. I'm just using the very tip of the brush, just doing some little micro lines with it. And if you haven't done this before, it's always good to practice a little bit on a bit of paper first, just to make sure you've got the technique right, just because you don't want to do this onto your actual moth if you've never done it before and ruin any details of your moth. So it's always good to have a little practice. If you're doing like a little technique that you've not done before, you could always practice this first. As you can see, we're just doing the center section with that leopard detail again, as I mentioned, with the little spots and lines and details, and just adding a little bit of a variation on that fringing and a few of the dark colors as well. So you can see we're really building up the layers now, and to my favorite part, adding the detail, and it really comes alive. So you can see some of the moths are looking almost finished and looking really detailed, and some of them are looking still quite basic at that ugly stage of watercolour where they haven't really got enough detail down and they're looking a bit too simple. So we've moved on to our box tree in the middle there, and as you can see, we're adding that fringing detail we talked about and just building up those lower layers. As you can see, with watercolour you need to be quite patient, and like I mentioned before, when you're painting more than one sort of like element or objects or insects or anything like that, then it sort of gives you time for the other layers to dry. So the other moths are drying while I'm painting on one specific moth, so that gives me a bit of a chance to be a bit more patient with those other ones. If you are just painting one moth, you'll have to be a little bit more patient while you wait for the layers to dry. So it's quite good to work on one wing and then move to the other wing, and then the first wing's dried a little bit and you can sort of move back and forth. So we're just adding some of the leg detail and the antennae detail, and then moving on to the swallowtail. This one is a very delicate moth because it is mainly yellow, but it still has a little bit of detail you can use with the grey yellow, for example, and just add that shadow detail, add a few little veins in the wings. So even though if it's one colour and there isn't a lot of contrast in like the pattern or the detailing, you can still add a lot of elements to it in the vein detailing, maybe the hair detailing, and maybe adding a little bit of a wash over the top like we're doing here as well to add a little bit more detail to it. So it doesn't have to be plain and boring, even if it's just a one colour moth. You can still add a lot of detail and texture to it to make it seem like a very interesting subject to paint. So you can see we're just mixing some darker colours now, and we're moving on to our walnut sphinx moth, and we're just really adding in that detail and just painting that up and adding some of those darker colours into the wings, and still remaining to keep some of that pattern as well that we're trying to keep to emulate our image. And just adding in some like really pretty washes, and you can see those colours are coming together now. We've got some really pretty like tan browns, some really chocolatey browns as well, some more grey browns, and almost some black brown as well mixed in for those darker shaded areas of the wings. So this is a super pretty one, and this is similar to the swallowtail in the sense that it's a sort of one colour moth, but you can see we're building up a lot of detail and a lot of interest using different techniques to build up that style of the moth. So just adding in those like background wings now, there's like some underneath wings and some details, just building those up on the layers and painting those in. And we've moved down to a smaller brush as well from when we started, so you can see you can use the larger brushes for the wash to get that water down, to add that wet on wet technique, to add some really nice like colours and blending, and then you can move down to the smaller details when those layers have washed, and you can do some wet on dry techniques, adding in some really pretty details, some lining, some fur texture, depending on the subject of what you're painting. So we're just adding in a lot more detail now to the little feet at the front, some more texture to the body of the moths, because they often have this little sort of hair fur detailing, and a lot of the contrast. That one's looking a lot more finished now. And then just adding the super final touches as we're going along, just adding a little bit of those sort of dark details, because the detailing between the light and the dark really helps to add that contrast and build that form of what you're trying to paint and that three-dimensional look. So you can see we missed the fringing on the right hand side of that Sphinx moth earlier, the Pandora Sphinx, so we're just adding that in now and just trying to make it look as symmetrical as possible. While getting in some really pretty details. This one was super detailed. I mean, I could have added a lot more detail to it, but obviously I wanted to keep it within a certain time frame for the painting video. And this video, the full length one on Patreon, is already over an hour because there's that much detail. But the good thing is, if you just wanted to paint one of those moths, you could flick through and just paint that one and come back another time to paint another. You don't have to paint 5 in one go, which could be a bit overwhelming. So don't feel like you have to choose 5. You could just pick 1 or 2, your favorites, and recreate those at home. So you can see we're just adding in all of the final details now to each moth, doing I think this is our 4th layer, maybe our 5th layer on some of them. You can do as many layers as you like until you're happy with your finished result, but we're just darkening up some of those blacks, darkening up some of the colours and the shading, just adding in those shadows when you've got the top wing on top and the wing below. It's nice to add a little bit of grey just around that top wing, just to create that shadowing effect, which helps to make it look a bit more 3D. And just adding in any darker textures, like I mentioned earlier, you can add a little bit of colour around the sides, and that helps with that as well to make it look more 3-dimensional. And I actually broke out my honeybee pigments. She's on Instagram, she's absolutely amazing. These are all handmade watercolours by her, and you can see I'm just breaking out some like gold bronze colours because the box tree has got a super shimmery like gold effect to it. So I really wanted to add in some of that goldy bronze watercolour, and that really helped add that shimmer and that final touch to our really pretty box tree moth. And again, it sort of makes it like more of a fun project, adding in those little touches that really helps to elevate your watercolour style and design. So we're just painting in the long antennae, which was back over the body, and adding in those final details on that one, and then moving on to our swallowtail again. So as I mentioned, it's quite a plain moth, but you can add a lot of that detail as well, just to make it seem more interesting, adding a little spruce, a little extra colour, and adding some more detailing as well around the base of the wings. And also moving on to our pretty walnut sphinx, just adding those final dark washes, which really helps add the contrast between the highlights and the shadows, and brings together the whole 3D look of it. So I'm not sure about you guys, but I'm absolutely desperate for a coffee after all this talking and voiceover. So I'm going to nip and have a coffee, and I really hope you enjoyed watching this, and I can't wait to see you in my next